It marks two occasions, actually. The return of two amazing people to New York City, Eleanor and Paul.
Hi!
And of course it marks the New York launch of Paul's debut novel, The Weighing of the Heart, which incidentally is available for purchase this evening. So if you fancy buying yourself a copy, and I highly recommend that you do, you can do so over there. Eleanor will be selling those after our Q&A. So tonight we're going to hear Paul read some passages from his book, his debut novel, and then he and I will be having a chat about the book, and then there'll be a chance for you guys to ask him questions also. So without further ado, please give a big, big round of applause to novelist Paul Owen.
Can you hear me with this mic, or maybe we should swap to, I think that one's better. Thank you. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book, The Weighing of the Heart. Should have folded that page down. Sooner or later, everybody comes to New York, and I was no exception. For me, it was art school that brought me over, and I left behind the brash primary colours of late 90s London, gladly and without remorse. Here I could reinvent myself, as others had before me, among the shining slabs of a city that seemed to have scale, where others only had size, where history was measured in the minutes rather than the centuries, and where each of its 10 million inhabitants began their lives anew each morning when they awoke and pulled up the blinds. After college, I did everything I could to remain, winning a job and the work permit that came with it at the Bougainville Gallery in Chelsea, spending the next few years living in a tiny apartment in Greenpoint with my girlfriend Hannah, working together at the gallery each day and growing gradually further and further apart. In early spring in 2011, things finally came to a head. Things finally came to a head, and I moved out, for reasons I don't really want to go into here. I left and went to stay on the couch of a former colleague in whom I'd increasingly been confiding. His name was not Jeff, but I have to give him a name, and Jeff will do as well as any other. Hannah's name wasn't really Hannah either. Jeff had two aunts who lived uptown in one of those huge late 19th century apartment blocks where wealthy families often take up a whole floor. Their apartment was enormous, sprawling, Jeff said, with an elegant roof garden looking out in a wide panorama over Central Park. But it was also ragged and unloved and slowly rotting away. His aunts only lived there 2 days a week, spending the rest of the time at their other home on Long Island. To make sure the place didn't collapse completely, they usually took in a lodger, and as luck would have it, Jeff told me, they needed one right now. Since I was desperate to find somewhere to live, he would take me around to meet them, and we could see whether we hit it off. Far from being desperate to find somewhere to live, I was in fact quite enjoying my evenings in his apartment in Clinton Hill, watching reality TV with his witty and outspoken girlfriend Severin, whose parents had named her after the character in the Velvet Underground song Venus in Furs. But I'm a very suggestible person, and I must admit that as Jeff and I talked about it more, I found myself drifting off into an agreeable fantasy about life in that cavernous apartment a stone's throw from Central Park. The white whirl of the Guggenheim visible from the living room window, MoMA, the Met. And I began to feel really quite excited about the whole idea. For the 5 days each week when the Peacock sisters would be away, I would have the whole palatial penthouse to myself, and it was pleasant to feel, even in a vague and materialistic sense, that I'd be making some progress in my life after my breakup with Hannah, which I felt had set me back a step as the rest of my friends busied themselves, getting married, getting pregnant, getting comfortably settled in for the next stage of life. So I went up there with Jeff and Severin after work the next Wednesday. Severin boasting during the subway ride that the sisters viewed her as the daughter they never had, and they introduced me to Marie and Rose Peacock. We all had a glass of California Red, and Marie and Rose took me on a quick whirl around the apartment, including the small bedroom beside the roof garden that would be mine. Then it was time for the Peacocks to leave for the theatre. We all took the lift down to the street. As Jeff flagged them down a cab, Marie Peacock asked me a few questions about my job, tugged thoughtfully at her coat cuffs, peered into my eyes, and abruptly proposed rent of $100 a week, a sum so minuscule for the Upper East Side she might as well have made it one peppercorn. I couldn't shake her hand fast enough. We've been looking for a lodger for a while now, she told me as we sheltered from the spring breeze under the building's awning. A year or two off and on since the last one, put in Rose. We like to have someone we know, continued Marie. Someone we know, or a friend of a friend, said Rose. Or a friend of a nephew, said Marie, waving a gloved hand in Jeff's direction. So it often takes us a while to find the right person. The last young man painted the bedroom walls green, Rose recalled mournfully. I think we'll say no painting the walls this time, decided Marie. Is that all right, young man? Of course, I said. You can move in tomorrow if you like, added Rose, as Jeff held open the cab door. So I did.
Interview one of my closest friends. So let's talk about the book, because obviously that is why we're here. It's set in New York, but it's set in 2011, but you didn't move here until 2015. So can you speak to your reasoning behind setting the book in a New York that kind of predates you, so to speak?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, although so the book, as some of you may know, it's about a young British guy who moves to New York, and he moves in with these eccentric elderly ladies called the Peacock sisters, and together with the young woman who lives in the apartment next door, they steal a priceless work of art from the wall of the Peacock sisters' apartment, and it's an ancient Egyptian scene, and as the stress of the theft starts to work on them, the imagery of ancient Egypt starts to come to life around them. And of course, as most of you know, Eleanor, my wife, and I have just returned from over 3 years in New York. So a lot of people think that the book must be autobiographical, but actually I started it quite a while ago. I started it, I think, in 2011, and really what it comes back to is this sort of obsession and love I've had for New York for many, many years, and part of writing the book, I think, was me living out this fantasy I'd had for a long time of living in New York and living that out through writing. And then it just so happened that towards the end of the process of writing the book, I actually got the chance to move here, and so life imitated art in that way. And I remember when we first moved here, and I was sort of walking some of these same streets that I had written about in the book, the same streets that some of the characters had walked, and I don't know if any of you remember this TV series from Britain in the 90s called Red Dwarf, but in that series there's an episode where the lead character, Lister, goes into this kind of virtual reality computer game called Better Than Life. And it's a bit like The Matrix, it's totally immersive, and while you're in it, you can be enjoying the game so much that you kind of forget that you are actually in a game. And sometimes when I was walking the streets of New York, that I'd fantasized about for so long, I started to sort of worry that I was in Better Than Life and that this wasn't really happening, and that I would sort of wake up one day, come out of the game, and I would still be a teenager in my mum and dad's house in Manchester, reading The Great Gatsby and Catcher in the Rye, and thinking about New York. But to come back to your question about writing the times before I moved there, I think one, it became obvious quite quickly when we moved here that I had got some things wrong in the existing draft of the book, and I think one of them is that you know, the book was very Manhattan-centric, and I think that New York for me before we moved here had always been really Manhattan, and that image of New York, the fire escapes and the skyscrapers and the water towers, and to me that all sort of was represented by Manhattan, and it became obvious to me quite quickly when we moved here that the cultural centre of gravity had actually moved to Brooklyn quite a while earlier, and that a lot of the scenes that I'd set in Manhattan, people's apartments, art galleries, the characters in the book just wouldn't really be able to afford to live in those places. So I had to change some of them. And another change that I made was the Peacock sisters, the elderly ladies in the book. They have a second home on Long Island, and for ages that home was in Montauk, but I'd never been to Montauk, and Eleanor and I went there one weekend, and we were just driving in, and I had this old guidebook, New York guidebook, but it was like 10 or 15 years old, and as I was driving in, Eleanor was just reading out a bit about Montauk, and it said something like, Montauk is a peaceful and deserted hamlet with very few visitors, and as we just drove in, there were like these 40-story hotels and golf resorts and stuff, and I just thought, okay, this is not suitable for the Peacocks at all. They are really not going to like this. No. Some friends then moved to a place called Watermill, Long Island, and I looked it up and it just seemed perfect for the Peacocks, so I moved the Peacocks then to Watermill, and they were much, much happier.
Well, look, obviously you speak so passionately about New York, as you yourself, Paul, that you also begin the book by saying, sooner or later everybody comes to New York, and I was no exception. And you go on to say, as Nick, here I could reinvent myself as others had before me. So how important are the themes of reinvention and second chances and even reincarnation, if we're speaking about the ancient Egyptian foods, to the overarching story that Nick and Lydia have to tell?
I think the theme of reinvention was always really important to me, and New York to me has always symbolised somewhere that people come from around the country and around the world to find a new start and to reinvent themselves. And for me personally, when I first came to America to live, because I went to university in Pittsburgh for a year as well when I was 20, when I first came, that feeling of reinvention was very important to me. And I remember getting to that university and meeting people whose ambition was to be a writer or a musician or an actor, and it just felt like here in America those dreams could be real, and that they were realistic ambitions rather than what they seemed back home in the UK, which was sort of pipe dreams that weren't really serious. And that had a big impact on me. But then when I came back to live again to live in New York when I was about 35 at this point, actually it felt quite different, and I still felt before we came, I still felt this excitement about the prospect of reinvention, but actually reinvention is quite different at age 35 to age 20. I think age 20 you're still something of a blank slate, whereas by 35, actually, you have figured out a few things about how you want to be perceived in the world and what you want people to think about you. And I think I really underestimated that there's a downside to reinvention, and that to start from scratch completely with a whole new, group of people actually can be quite tough. So that was my feeling about reinvention, and then, like with many things in the book, Nick's character, really takes that to extremes, and I think his attitude to reinvention is really unhealthy. Like, he has not been back to England for many, many years. He'll probably never go back. He never has any contact with his family. And as soon as he moves into the Peacock's mansion, as soon as he meets Lydia, he drops his old life in Greenpoint, and the few friends who you meet in the first couple of chapters gradually drop out of the narrative. So I think for him, he's really taking it to an unhealthy extreme.
Yeah, I think Nick is such an interesting character because he mentioned several times throughout the book that he doesn't like to reminisce. But for someone who doesn't like to reminisce, he's obsessed with an ancient civilization and their customs. So I thought that was a very interesting play. So was your fascination with ancient Egypt, did that come first, or did the character of Nick come first? And you thought, you know what would be a good complement to this is what these are.
The ancient Egyptian theme, which is the other sort of major part of the book, the artwork that they steal is an ancient Egyptian artwork or scene, but it didn't really start off like that. In the early draft, it was like a pop art work. But then I went to an amazing exhibition at the British Museum called the Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, and it basically told you what ancient Egyptians believed happened when you died. And I found it so fascinating because it's very similar in some ways to the Christian belief of going to the gates of heaven and St. Peter is there and he's weighing up whether you are able to, whether you're worthy to get into heaven. They have the same basic idea, but for them they have a weighing scale, and Anubis is controlling the scale, and on one side is a feather and on the other side is a heart, and if your heart is in balance with the feather, you get to go to heaven, which they call the field of reeds. But if your heart is too heavy, then you get eaten by this appalling monster called the Devourer, who's got the head of a crocodile and the body of a lion and the back legs of a hippopotamus. And they were like three of the most fearsome creatures that an ancient Egyptian could ever encounter. And one thing I found really interesting was that there was a fear, you could see in some of the spells, there was a fear that the person's heart would speak up against them in the balance and actually rat them out to Anubis and you know, to tell some tale like, oh, at university stole a bottle of wine from behind the bar, you know, or whatever. And so to stop it doing that, you could hold this little thing called a heart scarab, and if you were buried with that, it would protect you from your own heart speaking up against you, because they had the heart and the brain the other way around, so they believed that the heart was the seat of memory and conscience. And so when I saw this image of the weighing of the heart and started to sort of learn more about it, it was just perfect for the picture that Nick and Lydia would steal, because the whole book really is about you weighing up as a reader how much you trust Nick, and it's really the weighing of his heart. And it just seemed, it was one of those ideas where you know, once you've had the idea, you just can't believe that you tried to write the book any other way, because it fitted so perfectly. And there was just one really interesting other example of life imitating art, which is, I have this scene where there's a flashback to Nick's childhood, and he goes on a school trip to the British Museum, and it's strongly suggested that he steals one of these heart scarabs from out of a case in the British Museum. So I'd kind of written that scene, and then I wanted to describe the scarab properly. So I looked up on the British Museum website to try and figure out which would be the most suitable scarab, and I found one, and then I went down to the British Museum to try and have a look at it in the case, and I got there and it was missing from the case, and it just said on the side, heart scarab lost, and it was just exactly as if, you know, Nick had gone in there 20 years ago and stolen it.
Spoiler alert, it's in Paul's pocket, right? Well, there's a reference in the book where Nick speaks about 9/11 and how for him that was a turning point for him where he stopped being a Brit and he became a New Yorker. I want to know for you, Paul, what was the moment that you stopped being a Brit and became a New Yorker?
I think I've always felt that London and New York have in common that you can become a Londoner and you can become a New Yorker. They're both these melting pot cities where not only do people come from around the world to them, but also, I think, crucially, from around their own country. So, you know, I'm from Manchester and my parents have lived there for 40 years, but they weren't born there, and I don't think that they would consider themselves Mancunians. But I felt very quickly when I moved to London in my early 20s that I became a Londoner, and you know, a large proportion of London is made up of people like me, people who are graduates and who have moved to London because it offers them more opportunities and they're ambitious and they find the cultural aspect exciting, and so it felt like I'd become a Mancunian and a Londoner. And then when I moved to New York, I thought probably the same thing would happen, but it didn't really happen, and I was thinking about why it didn't really happen, and I wonder if it goes back to my obsession with New York and with like wanting to depict New York, and maybe I'm happier as an observer of New York than really feeling like I'm a full participant.
Well, maybe you and Eleanor should move back and just make sure.
I'm up for it. Let's do it.
Well, I want to touch on that note, actually. I want to touch on a very specific paragraph from the book that really spoke to me as a New Yorker of 11 years. Nick says, if I carried on reaching out to this city, if I carried on giving out so much, it would give something back, but it never did. So, how much of your own feelings are reflected in that statement? That's a strong statement to make about a very powerful city.
I think I did write that before. I did write that before moving here, and it was always intended to be Nick's, to be Nick's feeling rather than mine. But it does kind of ring true in some ways. You know, I think this is a tough city, and I don't think in any way that you know, I had an amazing 3 years here, both professionally and personally. It was brilliant, but I don't think I broke America in any way. You know, I think that like the people who really break America, you can count on one hand, like the Beatles, Ed Sheeran, James Corden. Like it's tough. When I moved here, I think 2 weeks after I moved here, a building on my block exploded and was like leveled to the ground. You know, it felt like welcome to New York.
You're gonna love it here.
I remember there's a picture by a guy called Raymond Pettibon that I saw in the new museum, and it was like the New York skyline, silhouette of the New York skyline, and it said Gotham City, the city that does not care. And I think there's some truth to that, but that's why we love it. You know, it's absolutely hard as nails, and it's tough, and that's why I wanted to be here. But yeah, it's a tough place.
And well, let's talk about a tough process. The process of getting a book published. I mean, this is your debut novel, so let's talk through how did you go about pitching it to places, and how did your partnership with Literati Press come to be?
Well, I've been writing for a while. I've been writing off and on really since my early 20s, and in my early 20s I got an agent and I had written a sort of draft of a book, and he sent it out, but it didn't really get anywhere. And if you go back and read it now, you know, you probably see why it didn't really get anywhere. And then I think around the time that I started this book, I kind of felt immediately that I was onto something, and that what I was writing now was quite a lot better than what I'd been writing before. And I think particularly the first 2 chapters seemed quite gripping, and when I gave them to people to read, you know, they were very enthusiastic. So I went back to that agent and said, you know, I've got these new chapters, I'm really feeling enthusiastic about this book. But because he tried to send that previous novel out, he kind of lost interest really, and so then I was sort of stuck with a bit of a dilemma, because you're always told as a wannabe writer that if you get an agent, you've got to hold on to them, and it's a crucial thing, and you'll never get a publisher without them. So it was quite an intimidating thought to think about breaking from that agent. But I just really thought, like, I've got something here, and if I stay with this agent, it's just not going to get anywhere. So I amicably cut ties with him, and I set about trying to get another agent. But it was such a different process doing that by that point, because when I was first trying to do it in my early 20s, you had to print out the chapters, you know, staple them all, like put them all in the envelope, post them out. Like, it was so time consuming. And I remember expensive, and I remember I remember doing five on a Saturday and 5 on a Sunday when I was in my early 20s trying to do that. Anyway, by this point, by about 2011, like, the whole thing had changed completely, and I just finished work one day, and I went to a secluded part of the office, and I got the Writers and Artists yearbook, which has all the agents' addresses in, and I just went through, like, starting from A, emailing all of them, and I think that night I got to M, halfway through the alphabet, and, you know, really by the next day I got some responses, so it was really, like, quite a heartening process. And so I got a new agent, and I started working with her, and I eventually finished a pretty workable draft, and we started sending it out. But then I had this real stroke of bad luck, which was that another book had just come out at that time, which was about an art theft in New York, The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. And this book was just massive, like, it was absolutely everywhere, you know. I think it was around, like, Christmas time, everyone was getting it for Christmas, you'd see it, you know, it's a big book, you'd see it everywhere. And all the publishers said, you know, something along the lines of, I like your book, but it's just too similar to The Goldfinch. So that was kind of difficult, and around the same time, or shortly afterwards, I got the job here, and I think once I moved here, there was a period where, you know, we'd moved to a new country, and we had started new jobs, and I didn't do anything on the book for quite a while. And then I sort of returned to it and went back to my publisher, my agent, and, you know, she said that basically because they'd sent it out to a number of publishers, they couldn't keep sending it out. So then again, I had a sort of dilemma, and I just decided that, you know, it was just too frustrating to me to think that this book was sitting in my desk, complete and good, in my opinion, and nobody was reading it. So I just decided to send it out to small publishers myself. So again, I got the Writers and Artists yearbook, and this time I went to the publishers section, and I just started at A, and I also got the US version, which is called Writers Market, and I started at A, and I just, every weekend, I was just sending it out to publishers. And the response was good, and I think, you know, you are always told as a writer that publishers will never speak to you unless you have an agent, and I think probably for big publishers that's true, but for smaller publishers I think it's probably not true, and lots of these publishers were more than happy to read the chapters and give me their view, and eventually I found Obliterati, and they're two guys. They set up the company about 2 years ago. The reason they set up the company is for the love of reading and for getting books out to the public that otherwise wouldn't have a chance, and I think that's brilliant, and it's been a really good relationship. And it was really nice actually when we made the decision to go back to London, it was really nice to feel that this was one of the things that we were going back to, was this book was just about to come out.
Well, I mean, that's very good advice to aspiring authors as to how to get their book published. Do you have any advice on how to combat the dreaded writer's block?
Well, I think one thing that I find, because of my journalistic background, is I'm quite good, like, if I get stuck in a chapter or don't know where it's going, I can kind of get us from A to B in a pretty basic way and then return to it later and finesse it. And part of that is, I think, because of the pressure that we work under at work, like constant deadlines, and I think that's been good for me, and just sort of getting it down and moving on to the next thing. But I get quite distracted. Like, I often work at home, and I sort of get a cup of tea and a glass of squash. You know, it's not like a sort of a Charles Bukowski style drink your 5 shots of whiskey and sort of hammer out a drunken manuscript. But I get a bit distracted and start like watering the plants or tidying up my books or whatever. And so when we were here, one thing that I used to do was, because the Guardian's based in a WeWork co-working space, and it meant that I could book rooms in any WeWork in the city. So on a Saturday or Sunday, I would just go through the WeWork app and find like a WeWork halfway up a skyscraper with a great view, book a room in there, and go and work there all day, and it was great, and it was a really nice way to be writing about New York and feeling immersed in it and seeing as much of the city as possible. And sometimes I would come down, there was one in Tribeca, and I remember coming down from, I'd been working on my book, I came down, it was about 5 o'clock on a Sunday, and there was this rave going on with all the WeWorkers, like, you know, on their hoverboards and motorised unicycles, drinking beer from a red plastic cup, and like the one guy would be asleep on a sofa. Like, wherever you are in a WeWork, there's always one guy asleep on a sofa. He's paying like $400 a month for this WeWork, and it's just like a crash pad.
Well, I think the question that everyone really wants to know, and after this, please, we'd love to take questions from the audience, but what are you working on next? What is next for you and your career as an author?
Well, I have been working on another book, and it's also set in New York, but this one's going to be set in the good old fierce city days of the 1970s, when New York was a crime-filled hellhole. And that was the New York I really first fell in love with, that New York of mean streets and Taxi Driver, and I really wanted to depict that. So that book's going to be about a failed journalist working for the New York Post, and he starts to look into the moon landing conspiracies, and he gets in with all the sort of these dodgy conspiracists, and he gets pulled further and further into their world. Anyway, that's the premise, and I've been working on a draft of it, and fingers crossed I'll get there with it.
Very exciting. Well, now we'd love to open up the floor and take questions from this gentleman here.
Are your literary heroes exemplars or influences?
Well, I think in this book particularly, The Great Gatsby was a book I was really drawing on, and it was one of the books that I think when I was first becoming so fascinated with New York, it was a lot of it was seeing New York as depicted in Gatsby. And then with this book, you know, it's about an outsider coming to New York, and you see it through the eyes of a newcomer and a stranger, and that's the same with The Great Gatsby, and the narrator of The Great Gatsby, who's also called Nick, and I stole his name for this. You know, he's an outsider too. He's a Midwesterner, and Gatsby is a Westerner, and I think one of my sort of pet theories is that a lot of the great depictions of New York come from strangers, foreigners, immigrants who have come to New York and are seeing it with new eyes. And I always think of PJ Harvey's great album, Stories from the City, Stories from the Sea, which really seems to sum up a lot of what I love about New York. So The Great Gatsby was a big one. Underworld by Don DeLillo was a big influence on me, especially when I was first starting to write, because I think it's chopped up into different narratives, and even though it's a sort of unwieldy 1,000-page masterpiece, it made me see that you know, there were different ways of writing where you didn't have to just write a straight narrative from start to finish, and that somehow sort of made the prospect of writing seem manageable to me. And then I think with this as well, Donna Tartt, who, as well as being my nemesis with the Goldfinch, her book, The Secret History, was a big influence on me. And I think with Donna Tartt and also with Margaret Atwood, they're both literary authors full of brilliant big ideas. But they also write page turners that you're really excited to read, and that was something I really wanted to do in this. I wanted to have both elements.
So, your first book is about a newcomer to New York. You're saying your second book is about someone on a news desk. How much of this is autobiographical or quasi-autobiographical? Like, how much of this is you as Nick as a character?
I think, that some aspects of Nick are extreme versions of my own personality, but I think that particularly in the second half of the book, Nick really goes off the scales in a way that I haven't. In terms of the sort of brutal takedown of news desk culture and journalism, I'm really going to have to research that one. It's going to be tough.
We'll take one final question, if there is one for Paul. Yes.
So you spoke a little bit about how being an editor has kind of influenced your process of writing. I'm always obsessed with people who write and edit all day and then go home and write and edit. So for you, did this feel like an escape from having to report on the Trump administration, or was it a completely was it sort of similar to journalism? Was it a completely separate thing? How did that work?
It's always felt quite different to me, and I think that because the type of journalism that I've always been in is hard news, and the thing that you're usually trying to get across is to tell a story as quickly and clearly as possible. And I think that when you're coming to write fiction, actually you're doing other things. Sometimes you don't want to get a fact across very clearly. Sometimes you want to leave it obscured and have the reader gradually understand it. You want to do things with structure, with pacing, with dialogue. And I think if I'd been in long form magazine journalism, creative non-fiction, I think that some of those techniques are used there, but they're not really techniques that I would use as a reporter or editor for hard news. So it always felt quite different to me. If there's one or two more we could do.
Yeah, does anyone else have a question? Yes, Jessica.
What would you most be pleased to see in a review of your book? What were the things you want them to pick out?
Good question.
There was a blogger recently who said that, this is really embarrassing, said that this book will be on A-level syllabuses in years to come, and I think that was really, I love that so much, because I think that when I was 17, 18, doing those exams, doing that English literature A-level, that I really kind of started to learn properly about literature and the way that we studied it in such detail. I think any writer would love to have somebody pour over their work in that way. So that really struck home. I think if it was GCSE, which is the 2 years earlier, every kid in the country would be studying it, and the sales would be astronomical. So that would be good too.
Do we have any final questions?
Do you find it enjoyable, Paul? The prospect of writing your novel, I think to a lot of people seems like torture. Writing 300 pages with all of the plotting and all of the problems that you might encounter. When you reflect on it, did you think, I could do that again? Well, obviously you can, but did you find that what kept you going ultimately? I really enjoy it, and I think I do find it very hard at the beginning of the process when you're first trying to sort of shape those ideas into something that might become a book. But I think once you've got a workable draft and you're into the editing and improving process, I really love that actually. That's the bit that I really enjoy so much.
I mean, I still feel like when I'd finished this one and started thinking about could I write another one, I just felt like, can I do it again? Like, can I pull it off again? And I really don't know. I still don't know if I can, but I do really enjoy the process, yeah. Just like you enjoy swimming.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of this chat, copies of Weighing of the Heart are available over here. So please grab a copy, get this phenomenal man to sign it for you, because I think it's safe to say we can expect very big things from him in the future. Paul, start thinking about who will play Nick and Lydia in the movie. My agent's name is Mark. And everyone, please enjoy the rest of your evening and give Paul a big round of applause. He's a debut novelist.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.